Welcome to those in person and those online joining us as well to the Strategic Landpower Dialogue. Really glad you're here. General Bob Brown, President and CEO of the Association of the United States Army, and we're very proud to partner with CSIS for this really tremendous dialogue that we'll have. And this is our fourth Strategic Landpower Dialogue. And really want to thank CSIS again for the great partnership and all that goes on. Now, we couldn't do this at all without the support of General Dynamics. So thanks so much to General Dynamics for supporting these great events. Would not be possible without them. So a big thanks there. We couldn't be more excited to have another tremendous leader in the fourth dialogue, General Jim Rainey, Commander of U.S. Army Futures Command, for a discussion on how the Army is continuously transforming how it equips, organizes, trains, and fights to remain the world's most lethal force today and into the foreseeable future. Today, the change to the character of war is happening at a faster pace than we have seen in many decades, and many would argue ever. Whether we're talking about first-person view drones, electronic warfare, the use of artificial intelligence for targeting, or new capabilities and players in the space domain, we are measuring the cycle of change and counter change on the battlefield in just days and weeks. To be effective, land forces must be able to rapidly innovate, adapt, and diffuse change across formations. But we are also seeing today's battlefield is blending these rapid changes with some fundamentals that have decided battlefield outcomes for centuries. A couple examples of these: artillery remains dominant, and certainly the lethality of the small unit with fit, disciplined soldiers and great leaders remain as critical as ever. We've also been reminded that war is often bloodier, costlier, and longer than anyone assumes, and land forces remain central. To paraphrase the historian T.R. Fehrenbach, if you desire to defend and protect the land and the people who inhabit it, you must do this on the ground by putting your young soldiers in the mud. Fortunately, the Army has the right officer leading the service's transformation to stay ready for the demands of the battlefield today while staying ahead of the challenges for tomorrow's battlefield. I'll only briefly summarize General Rainey's extensive bio, which you can find on the CSIS site online or the AUSA site, either one. General Rainey was commissioned as an infantry officer in the Army from Eastern Kentucky University in 1987 and holds a master's degree in advanced military arts and science from the School of Advanced Military Studies, SAMS, and a master's in public administration from Troy University. He has served in a variety of command and leadership positions, really from the platoon level all the way up through division command. And then key jobs in the Army is, for example, the Army's G357, and U.S. Army Combined Arms Center in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, CAC commander. He now serves as commander of Army Futures Command, the service's newest major command established in 2018. Since taking the role at Army Futures Command in October of 2022, General Rainey has led over 17,000 soldiers and civilians to ensure the Army and its soldiers remain at the forefront of technological innovation and warfighting ability. So I know our audience is excited to hear from General Rainey, so I'll hand it over to Dr. Tom Carrico, who will moderate our discussion. Tom, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, General Brown. We really appreciate your kicking us off. And as we've said before, we're just delighted and very pleased to have this partnership with AUSA. So we're going to spend most of this dialogue in conversational mode, back and forth. But we are also taking questions from online. For folks watching online, we got a full house here, but whether here or online, please submit them from the registration page, and they'll come through the U.S. Army NETCOM encrypted commands right here to my tablet, and we'll pose them to General Rainey as appropriate. So General Rainey, good to see you, and thanks for coming to CSIS.
Well, good to see you, and thanks for having me, and thanks to AUSA for the invitation and putting this on, and thanks to your great organization for hosting it. And I'd like to thank everybody, both here in the audience, anybody that's watching. I think the kindest thing people do for each other is give them some of their time. You know, it's the most valuable thing we all have. Can't get it back. wish you had more. So I never take that lightly, and I hope this is useful.
Great. Well, look, we're going to cover a lot of ground today, but really wanted to begin with the kind of signature question that we start each one of these events with, which tell us your view of the role of land power within the joint force, both today and to 2040.
Okay. The reason we have a military is, well, the reason we have an Army is to provide joint force commanders with the absolute ability to dominate the land domain, period. We do a lot of things, but that is the fundamental reason we have an Army. We have land forces and our great brothers in the Marine Corps, soft, incredible land forces, but the Army makes up the overwhelming majority of the land force. So our enemies being certain that they will lose a fight in the land domain, primarily to deter them, ideally, and you know, God forbid if we get in a war, the joint force expects and demands the Army can dominate the land force anywhere, any environment. I feel good about that. I believe we indisputably have the best Army in the world today. And making sure that statement is true today as it is, or as true in 27 as it is today, 30, 35, you know, pick a point in time on the continuum. That's really why we have Army Futures Command.
You can't spell homeland without land. So,
Yep.
So you just said it, your command, Army Futures Command. Talk to us a little bit about what it is and why it was stood up and how it's evolved since 2018.
Yeah, thanks. So still some, you know, some people don't fully understand it. So about almost 6 years ago now, and several years, you know, it took several years to plan, but the decision was made by the Army to dedicate one of its 4-star ACOMs to modernization of the Army because it's so important. I think it was obviously no surprise. I think it was a great decision. I fully support it. Because, and there's no bigger fan of training and doctrine command than me. I served there 3 times as a general officer. The scope and magnitude of the problem for one command to do everything, leader development training across optimal PFP, got to the point where it warranted taking parts of the enterprise and dedicating a command with initially the idea of modernizing the Army, and that has grown under Secretary Wormuth and General McConville, now General George, into a larger responsibility to transform the Army, which is a bigger task than modernizing the Army. And I got to say, cannot accomplish any of our mission without a whole bunch of teammates and partners. So it's a very interesting job. It's a by, through, and with type leadership thing, which, you know, most jobs are when they get that complicated.
So just in brief, the relationship between AFC and TRADOC broadly, and also ASALT. Connect those dots for us.
Yeah, it's not just them. So AFC is charged with transforming the Army. So I'll start with ASALT, and we have a great relationship with ASALT. The Honorable Bush is a phenomenal Ranger buddy. I personally think he's the best AE we've had, and since I knew there was an AE in the Army, 30 years or so. So if you talk about the M, modernization material, Army Futures Command is responsible for requirements. You know, the chief owns all the requirements, but I'm the ACOM commander who's accountable for requirements, which is half of the then acquisition process, which Mr. Bush and his teammates execute in accordance with law and guidance from the secretary. But transforming is everything, optimal PFP. So General Brito and TRADOC, doctrine, organization, training, leader development. Our great teammates at Army Material Command kind of lead our facilitization, which is fascinating. When you talk, people get locked in on something like a new tank, like the Booker. So we got a great new light vehicle, combat vehicle, mobile protected firepower. guess what? You got to have ranges. It's got motor pool implications, maintenance. So, nothing happens in isolation. And then FORCECOM, General Pappas and his crew, and General Flynn out in USARPAC, General Williams over in Europe, the warfighting expertise of the Army resides in the operating force. Almost everybody in AFC is an incredibly accomplished warfighter on the uniform side. But if you've been out of this fight for a year or two, so the men and women who are leading formations right now dealing with these problems all over the world, that's the richest source of information to me. So staying flat with FORCECOM is important. And then, of course, headquarters, DA, joint teammates, we fight as a joint force, so we can't transform in isolation. And then, people argue about the future. One thing nobody argues about is that we're gonna fight with partners and allies, so meaningful relationships, long-standing relationships like we have with NATO and critical newer relationships out in the Pacific, for example.
Yeah. Well, back to you mentioned.
So it takes a village to transform the Army.
Back in 2017, General Milley said, hey, here's our top modernization priorities.
Yep.
And then out pops AFC with the CFTs, the cross-functional teams.
Yep.
And, those have been within AFC. And you recently added a new CFT, for instance. And so how do you kind of see from the 2018, that was, 6 years ago, back to 2017, how do you see the modernization priorities in terms of steadiness versus evolution, and then likewise this modest change in the CFT structure?
Yeah, so I believe that Army modernization and transformation are in a pretty good place. We've had a pretty good 5-year run. If you ask me why that is, one of the main reasons would be the fact that we settled on priorities and haven't changed them. So they transcended, 3 chiefs, 2 administrations, 3 secretaries, and we've stuck with those modernization priorities. General George recently moved the network up to number 1, but inside the 6 that we started with, we've resisted the change. I've studied Army modernization, acquisition, when we've succeeded and when we've failed, and one of the big things is changing your priorities. Another one is moving requirements, moving the goalpost. So we have done a very good job, and it's not me, it's Mike Murray early in AFC and the men and women of AFC. We've resisted the temptation to move those around, which means really that we got them pretty close to right. The requirements is important because the cross-functional teams that were stood up as part of AFC, and they're a very simple concept that I explain to people, and they're like, really? You guys, it took you until now to figure that out? But the idea is take everybody that it takes to accomplish a mission and organize them. So acquisition professionals, requirement writers, the best and brightest at the centers of excellence in TRADOC, for example, put them together on a team, clearly identify a problem, scope it correctly, dogpile talent on it, give them access to senior leaders and decision makers. So that's the idea behind the CFTs. We've made 2 adjustments. We added one, contested logistics CFT. They're at full operational capability now. And that was probably just a realization that we should have had one. And so we were able to do that. I worked with General Daly, the then AMC commander. That's down in Huntsville. That's important because the center of gravity of sustainment for the Army is down in Huntsville, so we put it there. And Colonel Promotable Shane Upton runs that. He's doing a great job. And then most recently, we did an adaptation of one, so not a new CFT, but we took the APNT, Assured Position and Navigation and Timing, who basically accomplished the task they were given and are transitioning the capability to our teammates in the PEOs and other places. So we remissioned them against the larger problem of all domain sensing. And Mike Montalone, an incredibly talented SES, is running that. Most of them are going to stay in Huntsville, but we're going to move the leadership up here into the Beltway because that's kind of the center of gravity of the intel community, obviously. So we're excited about that. And both of those are illustrations, and we haven't shut any down yet, but we might. You know, they were not designed to endure forever, right? You stand up, get a mission, accomplish it, and then every person matters in the Army. So we don't want people. You know, I joke around, but I don't expect to have a 50th anniversary of a CFT. You know, like the 70th at TRADOC, 80th at Normandy. Yeah. Those are great things, but the CFTs are supposed to stand up, solve a problem, and adapt.
Well, you've talked many times about adaptability.
Yep.
And so again, we publicly said, here's our modernization priorities, 2017, 2018 timeframe. How do you see, because all this is tied to the threat, how do you see Russia and China adapting to us? We've put out there, here's our concepts. We're going to start doing things differently. How do you see them adapting, and what does that tell you about our future needs?
Yeah, I don't know if they're, we put out what we're doing and they're adapting to that. I think they went to school on us during the war on terror and looked for vulnerabilities and rapidly accelerated places that the joint force is vulnerable. A2AD, for example, in the case of China, they kind of optimized for the air and maritime threat, which is smart because our Air Force and Navy are so good, but it's also a potential vulnerability. I think they went all in on space at an alarming pace, for example. Russia, I'm not so sure about because what we thought about Russia pre-Ukraine turned out to not be very accurate. So I think people are still trying to figure that one out. I don't know if that answers your question.
Do you think...
if I can talk about adaptability, though, if you look at if you ask me characteristics that we need as a joint force and as a country, for that matter, the next time we get in a, and again, I do not, I hope that we do not get in a war that's, existential, nuclear-equipped superpower type kind of stuff. I think it's about deterrence. But in the event that we find ourselves in another conflict, I would put adaptability at the near top of the characteristics that we're going to need, because nobody's going to get the future totally right. It's about not getting it really wrong, seeing what you missed, and being able to adapt faster, which is a skill that we need to get better at as a military. We should get better at it now before we have to do it in combat.
So you've got futures in your command's title.
Yep.
Talk about your perspective on how technological disruption is affecting not the nature, but the character of war.
Yeah.
The speed with which that's coming and things like that. I think I've heard you say that the Army has historically not been it's not about technology, but it's about the ability to adapt and use technology well.
Yeah. I've said a lot of things. I'm not sure that was one of them. But 75 minutes, we'll probably get around to it. Several thoughts. I think you asked a character of war question, but I'm going to take a little liberty and answer. So when people ask me what's changing, what I think about what's changing, I always encourage people to start by thinking about what is not changing, for several reasons. I think it's the nature of war is very important. I think if you're trying to figure out the future, especially if you're spending big taxpayer dollars, you may or may not figure out the big changes. You better not mess up the not going to change stuff. And at the top of what is not changing, I would, I think it's indisputable that war remains a human endeavor. It's a contest of will between people. Pick an ongoing conflict right now, look at Ukraine versus Russia, the power and the decisiveness of the human element, the horror of war. Who are you fighting for? Why are you fighting? You're not going to fight anywhere where there's not going to be serious civilian implications of that fight. So people are still the thing. Land remains decisive. There are some that I think wish that war would turn into a exchange of precision munitions between people, but I think that's kind of short-sighted. I don't see any evidence of that. You know, people insist on living in the land. It's where everything is, and land is going to stay. I'm not going to say it is the decisive. I think that's kind of a pointless argument because we fight as a joint force, and if we fight somebody good, we got to be the best in every domain. But land absolutely remains decisive. And then the third one that nobody's talking about enough is that we're a values-based military. The United States is special. Our joint force is special because we abide by the law of armed conflict. Not hyper-restrictive ROE, but the law of armed conflict. And I do not believe that we are going to walk away from that. So when you look at, if you're looking to learn from something like what's happening in Ukraine, for example, or Gaza, Ukraine's a better example. You have to put that through a filter of would U.S. commanders, would our men and women who understand the tremendous moral responsibility to ethically manage violence, would they do that or not? And I think what my takeaway from that piece of it is that our systems can't just be a little bit faster than our enemy. We have to be so much better when it comes to decision making, because I believe we're going to continue to practice ethical decision making, even in the most horrific combat, and that's what makes us special. And if we walk away from that, it's kind of pointless, right? So what's not going to change? But to your actual question you asked me, I believe that we are at the most disruptive point in terms of technology since easily, and I'm not a historian, easily since the pre-World War II. And General Milley, smarter than me, says ever. So maybe somewhere between ever and certainly World War II. The last time things were this crazy, people were inventing things like airplanes, radios, combustible engines.
Yep.
So, and even then, as disruptive as those were, the pace of disruption, the magnitude, but the pace is what is alarming. Anything you think you know now is going to be different certainly in a year, maybe 90 days. The lifespan of a UAV, the EW UAV, it looks to me like it's about 6 weeks, right? So that kind of speed of evolution in the character of war. But I remind people that, again, not a professional historian, but a student, technology is always disruptive, but very rarely ever decisive. There's a few notable examples, but so I think the thing is not, just trying to figure it out permanently, like solving for X. It's how do you build that adaptability to what is huge tech disruption? I can talk about some of the things that are absolutely alarmingly changing.
Is the technology changed? But as you've already alluded to, the ubiquity of sensors,
Yep.
theirs and ours. The proliferation, theirs and ours, of PGMs. Mm-hmm. And so, former PACOM commander Admiral Davidson said that if it's fixed on the surface of the earth, it's dead. Maybe a little bit of exaggeration, but nevertheless. So do you think that this is a sort of a discussion point. Do you see it as inevitable that the battlefield will become transparent? There's a lot of sensors, commercial and otherwise, out there. Or do you think that perhaps with continued deception, camouflage, blinding them, that it might be a little more translucent on that front?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, you hit the two big ones, and it's actually the nexus of the two, right? So it's ubiquitous sensing. You can be seen almost anywhere, coupled with precision-guided munitions, which allow an enemy to then hit what he can see. And in the case of China, it's even more alarming because of the magazine depth advantage, especially if you get inside their interior lines. No, I don't. I mean, I've got all the respect in the world for Admiral Davidson. I think that's a healthy way to approach, the possibility that you're going to be seen and the possibility that you can be killed if you can be seen. I think what it's really doing is it's changing, and it's the biggest thing. If I was in a maneuver, if I was commanding an infantry company, an armored division right now, I would be very focused on, and I know our guys are, our men and women are, is we used to try and maneuver to avoid being seen. Now the challenge becomes, how do I maneuver in a way where if I can't challenge what the enemy sees, I need to now challenge what he understands. So the ability to confuse, to be unpredictable, the days of doing course of action analysis and picking the best course of action might be gone if it's too predictable. So you're gonna have to get into winning on suboptimal, less predictable courses of action, deception, camouflage. I think that there's a emerging, we've talked about it, but one of the things that's gonna be really important is counter C2. Countering the enemy's ability to command and control his formations in a very deliberate, proactive across all your capabilities, especially counter-sensing. Now I'm a little bit more optimistic than some folks, because it is very easy to confuse AI, large language models, satellites, and you just have to create a small amount of uncertainty to offset that capability. And then, one of the things, I don't know what's going to happen, but one of the things I believe we should be prepared for is the possibility of a short, sharp technological exchange where all this stuff cancels and nobody quits, and then you're going to be back in a what would look a more traditional fight where maneuver is going to be absolutely critical.
Yeah. So back to big picture AFC, the chief of staff talks about continuous transformation. Mm-hmm. You've got kind of short, medium, and long-term time horizons there. Maybe focus a little bit on the long term. Why is it important from an organizational perspective to be thinking the 2040 time frame? And how, what are the big thoughts that you're beginning to develop on the 2040 time frame?
Yeah. And I talk more about the decade. I think that long-term horizon is the decade from 30 to 40. And it's important. I think that's where the really big disruptions are going to happen. I mean, it takes time to transform. I think the second and third FIDEP out there, or where you have opportunities to, it's really hard to make big, giant corrections inside the FIDEP. So I think there's big opportunities out there. I think bring in the S&T capability, not just of the military, but of the country to bear, the tech innovation. I mean, all those superpowers where we still have a gigantic advantage, or all those opportunities are out in that 30 to 40 space. I think you're going to see some really, really interesting things. I think we're going to have to shift back to our more historical precedent of maneuvering to emplace fires, as opposed to the last 20 years where we've largely used fires to shape maneuver. I think offensive and defensive fires are going to merge into one thing. Not that there won't still be a protection requirement, but separate offensive and defensive fires. I think there's an emergence of an air-ground littoral that's at least as significant as the traditional land.
I love that phrase, by the way.
Yeah, Jim Greer, legendary soldier for life out there at Leavenworth. I can't take credit for that. I wish I could. The air ground, and then the biggest one to me is human machine integration. Yep. Whoever figures that out is going to have such an advantage, and there's every single determining factor currently, every advantage resides with the United States military right now, and capitalizing on that. So those are a few of the reasons I'm super passionate.
We're going to walk through each one of those, but before I do, before we move to that, I want to say, you've got to think these big thoughts about the Army and the Army's future in 2040 relative to the whole Army, relative to the Joint Force, and I presume the Guard as well.
Oh, yeah.
So how do you see, I'm thinking here about Project Convergence.
Yeah.
The recent Capstone 4. And so perhaps some takeaways, some lessons that you're seeing there from PC in terms of the big Army, the Joint Force, and if there's a Guard element. Think about that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we only got one Army. So, whenever somebody says, well, you didn't talk about the Guard, I said the Army. To me, in my mind, just up front, I mean, we only got a little over 1 million people. If we fight China, everybody's going. Everybody better be good. And a whole bunch of other people that don't know they're going yet are probably going. So, it's total Army, and General McConville and especially, now General George. I mean, when we talk transforming the Army, it's in the context of the total Army. So I apologize for not specifically calling out that. Project Convergence it started as a once-a-year experiment. Going back again, guys like Mike Murray and Jim Richardson and Ross Kaufman, so we started this working with our joint partners, and it started out as just a simple sensor to shooter thread, and over time we've expanded that. This one we just had in March was by far the biggest and I think the most successful joint and partnered phase out of Camp Pendleton. Then it was also joint, but a more Army land centric one out at the the national treasure that is the National Training Center. Big take. You've got to move to data centric warfare now. We're not going to, if we're connecting sensors and shooters and sustainers, episodically, we're not going to keep up. So we had some success there. The joint force, there's lots of opportunities for the joint force to get better with things like standardization of message formats and making sure the stuff we have can talk together and work. So an Aegis cruiser picking up a track, passing that to a Patriot, an F-35 passing tracks to ground-based forces. Those are things we did. The reason I'm a trainer. I love training. I love going out on training exercises. Experiments are cool because it's okay to fail, which is hard with American soldiers because you actually have to take time to explain to them that don't make this work just because you're awesome. If it doesn't work, I want to know before we spend the money. But once you overcome that hurdle, you go out and then you can do 1,000 reps, of something until you figure it out. So that, I think on the joint side, there's a growing realization that we should put more energy as a joint force into joint simulation, joint experimentation together. We just don't have enough money and time for people to be pursuing parallel paths or divergent paths or having, multiple services working on the same part of the problem. On the Army side, we experimented with our signature modernization efforts, which are all in a really good place. And we worked on a demonstration of next generation command and control, which is the big idea that we have, that we actually demonstrated that it's possible. So that's, you might have seen General George's recent comments about the Army going all in on that, and then human machine integrated formation. So taking no credit for it because it's all the people, but when we started this about a year and a half ago, with human machine integrated formations, the one smart thing I did was ban any briefings or PowerPoint. I said, I don't want to see it until I can go see men and machines, humans and machines together. And because of that, we're at a, think big, start small, go fast kind of approach to this. So we did a battalion level human machine live fire out in the Central Corridor at the National Training Center, which in less than a year, which just makes my point that the only thing keeping us from doing that is getting out of our own way because all the technology exists.
So let me pull the thread on, you mentioned a couple of warfighting functions there.
Yeah.
You especially highlighted maneuver and fires. And I remember hearing you say this over a year ago at the Fire Symposium in Lawton, Oklahoma, is you said in the past, first of all, you said the Army doesn't do attrition, we do maneuver. But now we're moving from maneuver and fires and support maneuver to maneuver and support of fires. So what is the relationship between those two functions in your mind? And doesn't it sounds to me like you're moving to a third thing in a way beyond our current situation that is, frankly, more fires-centric. Is that what I'm hearing? Is maneuver an enabler to fires?
Yeah, I say a lot of things again. So let me go back to,
Hey, I'm listening.
I appreciate it. Because I get in trouble with this one. Attrition versus maneuver. I am a big proponent and big fan of applying attrition to the people we're fighting. We are in the stomping business, when it comes to fighting. So applying attrition to the enemy, yes. What I'm trying to say is one of the superpowers and one of the reasons we're the best army in the world is we do joint all arms maneuver. So we would not settle into an attrition-based fight and trade our most precious, our men and women for acres for meters
Right,
for feet.
right.
So we do maneuver all for applying attrition to the enemy. But that wasn't your question.
but we're
it gets to
pummeling.
your next, it gets to your next point is, so in the coin fighting, in the last 20 years or so, we settled into fires, both lethal and non-lethal, as a shaping of maneuver. You know, intel drives fire, drives maneuver. Me included as recently as when I was commanding the 3rd Infantry Division. What I'm observing, because the defense is getting stronger and the offense is getting, it's still decisive, but the offense is getting harder and more costly and more difficult. Plus the incredible advancements in cross-domain fires, the ability to shoot from the land into other domains, the extension of ranges, the addition of things like loitering munitions. I believe that and candidly, the Army is not as big as I would like it to be, right? So we need to get back to grabbing a piece of ground for the purposes of whether it's Army long-range fires, Army conventional fires, the Air Force needs to extend its legs, the Navy needs to hit a port to, you know what I'm saying? So maneuver to enable the joint force to fire, both at the tactical level and certainly at the operational level.
Yeah, well, it's the anti-ship seeker on the Prism, that big franchise coming forward. It's the Tomahawks, on trucks, all that sort of stuff. But as you say, you're seeing a lot of the primacy of fires in Ukraine in terms of the demand signal for all that. So I guess as you look at, say, within the
The primacy. I know you're a fires guy. I don't know if I'd go down the primacy.
Okay.
The most important warfighting function is command and control, because our number one superpower is our commanders. We're a commander-centric Army, not the human, but the position of commander. And command and control, I think, that's the holy grail, right? If we get that right, I think we'll be fine. If we don't, none of the rest of this stuff's going to work, right? I think maneuver and fires, especially if you imagine an offensive and defensive fires, combined, really system, not a function. But nothing works unless you get the intel right, and if you can't sustain it, it doesn't matter. So it's kind of, it's kind of a system of systems versus a primacy.
fair enough. So, but within the long
But I
range.
did get like a big medal out at Fort Sill last time I was out there, so I think I'm like,
Howitzer Row.
I'm popular with the, I get invited to Sill more these days,
Yeah.
which hurts my feelings as a former infantry commandant.
Well, there's been some shifts within kind of the modernization, I guess, the efforts. Looks like a lot of innovation going on the cannon side. So how do you see the Army artillery, cannon-based stuff, 39 caliber, stuff like that? Is that sufficient for the ranges that we're going to need, especially in the Pacific?
Well, there's a lot to that question. The Pacific, it depends on what range. If you're fighting, if an infantry brigade combat team has to take a piece of ground to either protect the logistics node or position, agile combat, position our Air Force teammates, then you're going to need all the conventional fight capability. So I personally believe there will absolutely be tactical level fighting in the Pacific, although the Army's primary mission in the Pacific is to enable the joint force. But you're going to have to fight. The Chinese aren't going to cede ground anywhere, so you're going to have to be able to fight at the operational level. Range matters, but the whole maritime world is boiled. I'm not a Navy person, obviously, but it kind of boils down to about 11, 12, 13 global choke points, and the ability to influence those with the joint force. Right. So imagine land forces controlling both sides with the ability to affect the maritime domain. So my point is, you don't need to get millions of miles to be effective. But when you talk about cannon artillery, you're talking about close combat, close fight.
Sure.
The biggest thing I think we need to think about is capacity, right? So I've been watching, we've been 5 years, we're into some really good capability initiatives. I mean, the Army's long-range precision fires, the Army's got some very impactful programs that are either fielding or on the cusp of fielding. At the tactical level, we have great equipment now. We just have a capacity problem. So I'm starting to think, you know, like if you had a dollar to spend, you know, spend some of it on capability, but it's irrelevant unless the capacity goes with it. And even then, if you have good capability and capacity and you don't want to fight in the homeland, then positioning becomes equally important, to include the ability to protect anything you push, which is why I'm kind of thinking about this offensive and defensive merger that I described. And I'm not just talking about 155 production. I mean, the physical amount of firing units. One of my favorite stories I tell, not stories, history that I relay, Desert Storm, the great 1st Infantry Division was the initial formation who, you know, I think they called it an initial main effort. We would call it a supporting effort, but a U.S. Army divisions whose job was to put the initial breach in. And they had 4 firing brigades, 4 brigades supporting an infantry division in a, you know, it turned out to not be as hard as we thought it was, but I mean, because breaching's no joke, but I mean, like, right? So now you look at what's the force mix between firing brigades, protection brigades, and maneuver brigades. I think that's something we need to spend some time thinking about.
Yeah, that was actually the malice of forethought of my comment about the Guard earlier was, you know, the degree to which there's some surge capacity that might need to be put into the Guard, for instance, as well.
Well, I mean, yeah, we have, you know, and I defer to the chief and really the secretary. I mean, over time, you know, we need to look at total compo, what's in which compo, when are we going to need it. That's pretty well known. But you know, there's some things. I mean, the guard is good at artillery. I mean, they're really good at it. They're good at everything. But I mean, if you look and it's actually fortuitous because when I was the G3, I spent a lot of time understanding, you know, homeland. Because the other thing about the Army, we dominate the land. We also do windows. You know, the Army does what the country asks. And if we got a plan for it, if we got doctrine for it, great. If we don't, we figure it out. So, and getting the emergency response, DISCA, things like that. If you're a governor and you have a crisis in your state, you want some soldiers. You probably want some smart soldiers. You probably want some trucks. You probably want some strong backs. You probably want some good command and control, you know, so the Guard, you know, good artillery formations have all those things in spades. They're good at sustaining themselves. They're good at problem solving. So that's an example where it's kind of a natural fit. So I wouldn't want to move it all somewhere and break something that's really important in the process.
Yeah. So last time I talked about, before we move off this subject, at Fort Sill a couple weeks ago, I saw you hold up this book, Red God of War. And I thought that was striking. It's a book from 1986 about Soviet artillery. Why was that worth your time to bring out? I'm a fan of the book. Yeah. I just had to bring it from upstairs. But why are you looking to a book from 1986?
That's good. You have the other copy.
Exactly.
I had to
at least 2.
It's funny. Sorry, this has nothing to do with this talk, but after I held that up and talked it, apparently that thing's out of print. It costs like $5,000 now.
Oh, good to know.
On some website. So one, keep your eye on it while my aide's around. But walk off. But no. So one of the best things somebody told me once, and I'm sure somebody famous said it. I apologize for not citing it. Is if you want to learn something new, read an old book. And if you're thinking about, you know, transforming the fires warfighting system, getting back to capacity-based, you know, fires-based maneuver. We were a lot better at this at a point in time in our history. And the Russians, who I'm not super impressed with their military, obviously, but they've always been a fires-based army. And that book is just a really well-written, thoughtful, detailed analysis of it. I'm not advocating we go to that, but people should understand it. And I'm not just, you know, pandering to one of my heroes out there in the audience, or J.T. Thompson, I think's watching, who's my peer, who's the best fires guy I've ever seen, who taught me everything I know. But, you know, in the art science continuum, artillery guys don't have the luxury of us maneuver, so if you're 95% art, 5% science, that makes you a charismatic, aggressive infantryman. General Brown is a great example. But if you want to do like this, there's some physics and math. You kind of got to be smart, and that book really takes that apart in great detail.
Gotcha. So defensive fires, the other half of another part of what's out of Fort Sill, for instance, seeing just tons of the need and the desire for counter UAS.
Yep.
Likewise, the need and desire for cruise missile defense. The Army is doing the NGSRI, the Stinger follow-on program right now. Yep. How do you think about the demand signal for those? And again, we're seeing the demand for this massive now. Where is this going for 2030, 2040?
Yeah. Well, it's no secret for a lot of good reasons, and the people making those decisions at the time. Oh, back to the artillery. The late, great General Odierno wrote an article about artillery-based maneuver in Korea. That's just something everybody in the Army should read, and surely everybody in the fires maneuver business. I'm sorry, what was your question again?
The
defensive fires.
The trend on counter UAS and CNC.
This is a recent thing for me personally, and I don't claim, I should have said it up front, I don't claim to have the answers to everything. I have more time to look at it and study it than most. It's my job. I got phenomenal people helping me in and out of the government, but it appeared, 4 years ago, when I was at CAC, I was the CAC commander. I was like, why the hell did they move the Air Defense School to Fort Sill? Because now I got to ship everything out to, now we got to go out to El Paso to shoot anything. I'm like, man, I wish that we had a do-over. It was exactly the right thing to do. Dan Carbler and I used to just throw down, about this, and he's 100% right. I'm like, my basic theory was, they painted the water tower, so they had to make them one thing. But it's absolutely merging together. And to be clear, the protection warfighting function / system is not going to go away. So I'm not saying that you merge protection and fires. I'm talking about the air and missile defense, counter UAS capability has to get back into our combined arms maneuver, all arms maneuver formations right now. We should do it as fast as we can. And the reason is the speed of change and conflict and the size of the military. We're not going to have the luxury of having two bespoke systems. So, for example, right now, we have radars that do one or the other. We have mission command systems for both, neither of which is very good and unnecessary when we move to data-centric warfare. We have different commanders. We have different staff sections. So it's not about the effector, like figuring out how to get a HIMARS to shoot down, like the fire stuff is the least of the problem, having offensive and defense. Now, if we're going to modernize and make something new, it would be nice to build dual capability, but it's not about the effector or shooter. It's about everything else in those ecosystems.
It's the formations.
To include, the O, the organization, is something we need to look at, and especially the L, the leader development. I don't think air defense branch and a fires branch. This is just Jim Rainey. This isn't, we freak out. It's not Army thing, but I think we need to start looking at opportunities. Do we have that right? Or is there a merger? Do we need to stratify it one way or another? Because, it's just becoming one thing. I mean, you can't treat this different than this. If somebody shoots at you, you got to kill them. To get to your question, the UAS thing, it's crazy. And 20 years worth of not really doing that, now we're playing catch up. The good news is the technology's there, we have capabilities. What you're not seeing, and I don't want to make light of it because it is the problem today in CENTCOM, it is the problem. If we go to war in the next 12 months, it's going to be a huge problem. But I'm a little more optimistic because what you're not seeing is anybody execute joint combined arms maneuver, right? So if somebody was flying UASs at us, we would fight the UAS, but we would also be fighting wherever they came from, plus their maneuver force, plus bringing the joint force to bear. So I'm a little more optimistic. It's hard to drop a quadcopter grenade into the turret of an M1 tank when it's coming at you 70 kilometers an hour with a couple hundred of its friends and you're on fire. You know, I mean, it's just hard.
Yeah.
So not to make light of it, it's a big problem in the homeland and fixed site security and protection. But high power microwave, directed energy, the right mix of kinetic and non-kinetic solutions is something that we're, you know, it's one of General George's absolute priorities.
Yeah. So I think
And the Secretary.
what I'm hearing is that especially at the lower levels, what you're calling the air littoral, especially at that level with counter battery fire and SHORAD and that kind of thing, that there's a lot of similarity, and that the FA and the 88 commanders have a lot more in common than perhaps with other parts of the Army, a big Army. And so when you say merge, you know, what does that mean? Do you mean organizationally, at the platform, at the institution? What does merge mean?
Well, I think we need to experiment with it. So the good news is we're on our way to putting air defense back into our maneuver formations. And I'm biased. Every single person in the Army is of the same value. They're not all of the same importance. And I believe that you know, everybody exists to put that rifle squad, tank platoon, artillery battery, right? So the Army I grew up in, infantry, armor, artillery, air defense, artillery, engineers. Combined arms, five-finger death punch, right? So we got to get that back into our formations at echelon. There's an element of counter UAS that's akin to like NBC, right? Like every soldier has a mask, has a protective suit, has some skill level 10 response. You know, you're supposed to be able to treat, you know, I should be able to treat you. There's individual skills that everybody needs to get back to, but we need to get back to air defense artillery as part of an organic part of our formations at echelon. The sooner we do that, the better we'll be. Because the material thing is important, but you have to have somewhere to land it. You have to have the school and TRADOC to send them to. You got to have NCOs who used it when they were E4s, who know how to train. I mean, the Army is its best when we transform the right way. So, and the engineers, I would put, you know, we haven't exactly kept pace with engineer modernization. So that would be a close second. The merger thing, I don't know. I've asked, and General Brito's a phenomenal teammate, and Beagle out there at CAX, one of the best guys we got. We got great leadership out at Fort Sill, you know, Phil Brooks. Interestingly, is an artillery guy who commanded an ABCT in the Great 3rd Infantry Division when I was there. So I got a lot of confidence in him. They're going to figure this out. I don't know. I don't think it's a mash 13 and 14 together holistically. If it was me, I think guys on cannons and guys doing SHORAD have more in common than guys doing SHORAD and guys figuring out Patriots. And the artillery branch has always kind of been two separate tribes. You know, as an outsider, it's always kind of been the rocket guys and the fisters. So maybe it's if you're in a division, there's a hybrid, you know, tactical close combat 13, 14, right? And there's some things like the warrants. I mean, the warrants need to be experts at a thing. So I'm not arguing for holistic. I'm talking more about, you know, if you're a platoon sergeant, you should be able to be a platoon sergeant, either one. If you're a company, you know, we do it all the time. I'm an infantry guy. You go to the Rangers, you go to the 82nd, you go to the 1st Cav, you go to 3rd ID. I mean, you're either good or you're not, and you can adapt to a couple of different types of equipment.
Yeah, and you know, I think it's
But I don't know. We'll figure it out, though.
The MDTFs are doing experimentation on this front.
Yep.
You know, I'm struck, I think, as one of the MDTFs in the Pacific has a balloon platoon, so back to all domain sensing. You know, Army SMDC Command has a high altitude office, right? So getting up there for sensing, whether it be the high altitude or very high altitude, any reaction on the demand signal for that?
The multi-domain task force are leading our learning about the future of war. So I'm super excited about them. I pay real close attention. It wasn't my idea, certainly. It really wasn't even an AFC. It was more from the General McConville level leadership of the Army. And General Flynn, who's phenomenal, has really leaned into it as part of his competition out there in the Pacific. And we're learning a lot of a formation that's purpose-built primarily for intel that's designed to operate in all 5 domains with partners as part of as an inherent part of the joint force. And yeah, their ability to employ long-range fires is wholly dependent on their ability to sense. And what we're really learning is it's not so much the sensing, it's make sense, right? So with the ubiquitous sensing thing works both ways, right? The amount of data that's coming into a headquarters. So I kind of tongue in cheek, but only half kidding, say that we don't really have a sensing problem. We don't have a data problem. We have a making sense of the data that's coming in problem. So whether it's balloon, I think the balloon things are fascinating. Solar powered UAVs that can fly from, it's all interesting. I think I personally think there's a joint force, back to my earlier comments, what Title 10, who's going to do it for the joint force? And then, does the Army spend Army money on other services responsibilities? So there's a little bit of room for that because it's not that anybody's doing anything wrong. It's just emerging at a pace where, the air-ground littoral, the coordinating altitude, low Earth orbit, there's a little bit of figuring stuff out.
We would try to figure
But
out.
I'm in favor of, inundated sensors that don't give the enemy to take away. I'm certain that if we fight somebody good, we will not have unlimited access to space, for example.
Right.
Whether somebody can take it away or not, that's a different classification probably. But certainly, if I was training to go to war, I would be able to fight with, degraded space. So those other kind of sensors become really important.
So lots of discussion and attention to different kinds of unmanned systems, UGVs, you talked about human machine teaming. That was another function I wanted to have you kind of tease out. I think RICTO is standing up some new efforts on the robot front, and this seems like the scouts and the pack mules of the future. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm a huge proponent of human machine integrated formations. So let me unpack that a little bit. I believe, being a little critical of the Army, and I was part of it, we were kind of going down a machines replace humans. And there's all kinds of very valid concerns about autonomous machines and back to my point about being a values-based military, the ethics of it. But what I am a strong believer in is it's not about humans replacing machines. It's how do you optimize the two so you get a better capability. So how do we take risk and move it from our humans, our most valuable asset, to machines, right? No blood for first contact. The technology absolutely exists today. The enemy will get lucky once in a while, but we should not ever trade blood for first contact, whether it's a minefield, an IED, the enemy laying in wait. So transfer risk to machines. But even more important than that is then you optimize your humans for the things that only humans are ever going to do. The art of command, values-based decision making, curiosity, instincts. We're not going to teach computers to do that. So how do you put them together? And then equally important is, we buy stuff, but we fight formations. So how do we move to formation-based thinking? So this is perfect for that. The RICTO thing, RICTO's awesome. Some of the best transformation successes we've had is RICTO. So it's not RICTO doing HMI. I worked with Honorable Bush and the Secretary and the Chief, and Rob Rash, the RICTO director, is partnered with Ross Kaufman, my deputy, Rob Collins, who's Mr. Bush's deputy, and Beagle, who's Brito's deputy. So kind of those 4 3-stars are driving and working with the 6 and the 2. So it's a major effort for the Army. We have platoons right now for infantry and armor. The commandants are working on what does an artillery battery look like, what does a ADA battery look like, what does an engineer company. And the idea is to take a platoon that's the right combinations of robots, payloads, manned vehicles, humans, and take risk off of soldiers and optimize, because the battlefield's getting crazy. Like I had enough trouble in a turret in combat trying to kill everybody and talk to people in 3 different voices, right? That was before you got to worry about, 3-dimensional counter UAS, everything else. So it's really about taking anything that doesn't have to be done by the humans off. So I think it's going to blow up. I think people are going to look back. The UAS thing, like I said, the problem today, it's fascinating. I think what we're witnessing is the very leading edge of the major disruption of the land domain that's going to be caused by machines. Go back, look at what the UAV did to the air domain, late 1990s, just craziness. Maritime domain 10 years or so ago, major disruption. Look what's going on in the maritime domain now. Ukraine's doing a pretty good job without a navy. What General Kirill is doing over in CENTCOM, it's crazy. Physics, land was last because of physics, which is also on my list of things that are probably not going to change fundamentally in the future. So it's just, but technology is now getting to the point where it can actually have meaningful, significant disruption in the land domain. And we better be ahead of that. So 5 years from now, people are going to look back and say, yeah, that UAS thing in Ukraine, that was the leading edge of what is a monstrous disruption that's coming.
So, a lot of the UAV stuff has been an instrument, a tool of infantry.
Yeah.
Very much so. But there have been some suggestions here in D.C. recently, some talk about a UAV branch for the Army, putting a new branch. Reactions on that?
Yeah, I fully support my chief's answer, which was probably not yet. No, I don't know. I mean, it's early. Certainly it's too early for that. I think unmanned systems, unmanned aerial systems are going to come to bear at echelon. So I think individual soldiers being able to employ them, just like they employ their weapon. So 11 Bravos, I think the tanks, should be able to have a robot sitting next to them that can launch UAS. So I think it's every maneuver person's going to need them. They have huge sustainment implications. And then as far as formations go, we do have formations. We have a UAV platoon, probably not big enough in our BCTs. We have Gray Eagle companies in our divisions, not big enough, not enough. We have a 15 series, several 15 series MOSs for enlisted soldiers and warrant officers that are UAV specialists. So I don't know that it's going to warrant its own branch. And certainly I'd say it's too soon for that. The bigger thing is getting UAVs into our formation at echelon right now so we can train. Our chief is 100%, I would do it even if I didn't agree with him, obviously, but I 100% agree that we need to get UAVs into our formations now for the leader development, get our soldiers used to doing them. We have good requirements and good acquisition approaches for UAVs at echelon. We need to stop buying a thing and buy a capability, right?
Well, a capability is, here's a question that's come in, a capability in terms of teaming is, this person asked, could you give us an update on how the IVAS, the Integrated Visual Augmentation System, is doing, and kind of what's the plan forward on that?
Yeah, so, Mr. Bush and I testified about this. IVAS is a potential 10x, upgrade, so is worth pursuing. If it was a little bit better than night vision, I would probably not be as open to it, as big a fan as I am. But the potential for our most important formations, our rifle squads, our light infantrymen, to be able to achieve a 10x advantage, but through situational awareness and understanding, plus the ability to train with it, plus the ability to rehearse with it, do AARs. So the potential is very much worth pursuing, and we've had some progress. We have we're getting our hands on 1.2, which is the next version coming in. It's going to go to our soldiers this summer. We're going to give it a thorough workout to make sure it's something that we want, and then there'll be a big decision point on the acquisition side for the chief and secretary.
Yeah.
Mr. Bush.
Well, I think if we could shift to logistics, another question that's come in, this is from a Hill staffer, as talks about the new CFT contested logistics, as they expand their role and issue RFIs for things like a 1-ton cargo UAS, how is the CFT, how is AFC leveraging best practices from existing ongoing efforts within the Army, such as the Virginia National Guard's Advanced Mobility Initiative?
Yeah.
I don't know what that is, but
No, neither do I, but I have somebody take a note and check into it today. I should.
okay.
So autonomous and robotic, so one, we got a problem with contested logistics. The Pacific Ocean's really big, it's far away. The Army, one of our superpowers, and one of the things we do for the Joint Force that is most valuable is we sustain, Title 10 responsibility to sustain the Joint Force. I don't know if I really like the contested logistics. That's a term of art, but my understanding is logistics has always been contested, and it's hard even when it's not contested. But taking advantage of other innovation that's happening, especially in the commercial industry, but the opportunities to move to autonomous and robotic applications. So instead of having a bunch of big watercraft that have a brigade worth of equipment on it, can we get to fewer vehicles, mostly autonomous, that disperse that threat and cause bigger problems? The robotic implications are all over the place in industry. If you look at the offshore oil industry, if you look at the way I won't name companies, but the big successful companies operate. So we're pursuing that very aggressively. That's what the RFIs. There are UAVs that are lifting mill vans, containers off of aircraft that industry figured out during COVID when they had necessities and mother of invention. We need to get into heavy lift, autonomous shipping. The other big things they're working on is predictive logistics. I don't own a Tesla. My neighbor does. The amount of stuff down there in Austin, everybody's got them, but that car tells the owner things, it tells Tesla things, it feeds data, that is not new technology. But a tank and a Bradley, you're still pretty much got a guy on a radio or somebody hitting a keyboard. So how do we very quick, and I don't want to reintegrate and reinvent a turret, but how do we quickly get the data that is knowable inside our combat systems off of it and into a way so that when our logisticians do run a convoy, they're pushing exactly what's needed, not anything less or anything more. And then there's a whole demand reduction. If you want to solve the logistics problem, one of the best ways to do it is to reduce the amount of stuff that you have to move. So hybrid engines, alternative batteries, alternative fuel supplies. So that's where that contested. But
let me.
But I will check into the Virginia one. Thanks for the question.
Let me come back to you on the autonomous things makes logistics easier, because perhaps in some respects, but might they not also create a strain on logistics? Those things have to be refueled. They got to be rearmed. They got to be protected so that they don't get captured. Whether it's a USV or a UGV.
Yeah. I don't. If I said easier, I didn't. I meant more effective. It's the loss of life and equipment that argues for the dispersion more to me. And no, that's one of the myths, that moving to human-machine integrated formations is somehow going to allow us to have a smaller military. You're just transferring. Somebody's got to maintain it. You're just getting them out of the rifle platoons and tank companies that are doing the fighting, but you're going to have the backside support. I don't think it'll be growth by any means, and I think we can get better, smaller, effective formations, but not in the aggregate. No, it's about risk avoidance more than it is about being easier. It would obviously be complicated, but I'm telling you, if you look at what industry can do, go down to a modern port in the U.S. right now and look at that as how, if we went to war in Europe or the Pacific, how we would operate. I think, and this is true to any U.S. industry of any type. I have, in 18 months in AFC, I've not asked somebody to help us and been told anything other than, yeah, absolutely, how can we help? So I think leaning into that was my main point.
Well, on the first point, I'm reminded that the took a not insignificant part of the Army to feed and maintain horses and pack mules in the past. And then on the industry side, what you just commented there, okay, so what do you want to see from industry? What do you want to hear from industry in terms of making things better? And I would say, I would add to that, you frequently hear military and DoD say, go faster, do better, make it cheaper, all this sort of things. But DoD is ultimately the monopsony here, and DoD is ultimately the customer. So how can industry and DoD do better to work together?
Yeah. The number one thing I would ask for industry is patience. Stick with us. We cannot lose, our technological advantage in the U.S. is a superpower. I personally think it's as much of an instrument of national power as the rest of the dime. It's one of the places we still have a marked advantage over anybody we're going to fight. And what I worry about is some, again, staying away from specific companies. There are some companies, some of the best companies in the tech space are dual use companies. So it's even more dangerous than some of the ones that are more traditional defense. And they're, we absolutely need them also. But what I worry about is a company that we need that can make all the money they need to make and, can turn away commercial business sticking with the department. We're getting better at it. There's a clear understanding we need to go faster. PPB reform commissions, I interact with members of Congress. They understand that we need to fix some stuff. As far as inside the department, it's everybody. I mean, it starts with me. I'm the requirements guy. We got to move to capability-based requirements and quit trying to, write a 50-page document that says I need this, this, and this, which does one of two things. It either closes you out to innovation that you don't know about, or gets you exactly what you wanted that's OBE by the time you get it. So the characteristic of need statement for next generation command and control that we just posted to sam.gov, 2.5 pages of what we desire from our network that'll unlock industry. So moving to capability-based requirements, that's on me. Acquisition, I don't bag on the acquisition community. They do what they're told. They go out and acquire the requirement. I think that I'd put the Army people up against anybody, Mr. Bush's leadership, but we got to go faster in the acquisition space. Fiscal, I'm sorry, I got a long answer to this one because it's a complicated problem. Fiscal agility, whether we have enough money or not, we have the money we have, but the ability to move it in the year of execution inside the PB. If you ask me what, as a AFC, what do we want in 24 and 25, I can give you great clarity, great specificity, almost impossible to move money. If you said, what do you want in 2030, I'd say, well, you can start at ACAT 1, we're palming out there, it's in make-believe land, you can start new programs, no idea what we want, with some exceptions. I know I want a new tank, a new infantry fighting vehicle, best rifle squad ever, but generally speaking, when you can move money, you don't know the requirement. When you understand the requirement, you can't move money, we gotta fix that. Contracting, we got the best contractors in the world. It's not the humans. You look at something like COVID, they basically saved the country. They can go as fast as they have to, but there aren't enough of them. And they need to be embedded in the people trying to transform. Testing, the whole testing enterprise, again, great people doing what they're told by law, but we can't test software the same way we test chemical protective equipment. We can't test an unmanned UAV to the same standards we test a helicopter. I could go on. And there's probably a few others. Industry, the idea of the big integrator that's going to make a bunch of I think we need to reimagine that. I think there's an opportunity for the best companies to self-organize in a way that brings to bear and unlocks the best capabilities of our companies. I think we're going to see that start to happen more. So a bunch of opportunities inside the department.
And I was just going to react to so much of that acquisition process you talked about would appear to be exactly what Project Replicator is aimed at, ultimately making the acquisition cycle more agile. So we've covered a lot of ground in terms of kind of the future of futures, looking forward. You mentioned, if you want a new idea, go read an old book. What are the articles and the books that you found informative and useful for your thinking? What would you like people to be reading to be thinking different thoughts as well? Could be something old, could be something new.
Well, I'd like them to be reading and be students, in general. There's so much to do. Origins of Victory, Andrew Krepinovich's book's one of the best things I've read lately. Jack Watling is a Rusi guy who's the Future of Arms, I think is the name of the book. He was just down at AFC. I read his book and paid for him to come do an LPD, if that's any endorsement there. Freedom's Forge. Some of you people that were in the Army last time, we were worried about this, but Freedom's Forge is a book that tells the story of really a couple years before World War II, how this country brought its superpower to bear. And it's not the defense industrial base. I would offer it's the American industrial base that we needed last time, we're going to need next time. It wasn't big defense companies necessarily. It was RCA and GM and GE and Ford. So that book has a lot of application for what I believe will be the next time that we fight. And then I'm rereading an all-time classic called Military Misfortunes, Cohen and Gooch. It's a analysis of why militaries fail, and its history, and its failure to learn, failure to adapt. So it's kind of got a strong argument for the importance of learning and understanding what you're dealing with.
Great.
There's a few.
Well, thank you very much, sir. This has been a tremendous tour de force covering all this ground. And please join me in thanking General Rainey for his time.